very good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Alternative Roadmap, this week's edition of What Now, What Next, and a great discussion we have for you all, talking about the event, sports and tourism-led recovery. And what a week to talk about this. Firstly, huge success for Victoria to be able to see the Melbourne Vixens take victory, and I've got my scarf, which I can proudly wear. We saw Richmond beat Geelong. Two Victorian teams play off in the grand final in of course, Brisbane. And then we saw also the NRL final with Melbourne Storm also take victory. Now, I can't bring myself to wear a Richmond scarf, being a mad St Kilda supporter. And my apologies for not having a Melbourne Storm hat, which I left at home. But certainly I'm there being able to cheer on the great success that we had over the weekend. So some great victories, and also it comes at a very, very important time with some announcements that's been made today, opening up Victoria, which we'll talk about. I wanted to, before we go into today's announcements, which is very important, I wanted to welcome Earl Eddings, who's the chairman of Cricket Australia, Marne Fechner, who's the CEO of Netball Australia, and also Dr. Jeremy Johnson, from the chair of Tourism Restart Taskforce, and also the former president of ACCI and VCCI, and on top of that, the former CEO of Sovereign Hill, a great place that certainly I'm sure many of you would have visited. Welcome to all of you. So let's just, if we could just kick off with some very important changes to today. So we now have the 4 restrictions to leave home being lifted. So there's no restrictions in terms of us leaving our home, which I'm sure people are really relieved about that. A lot of hospitality reopened, which I'll talk about that in a minute. Retail opening, outdoor gatherings up to 10, beauty and personal care services opening, and we've got personal trainer, fitness, dance reopening for outdoors up to 10 people. What this means, just in a bit more detail, and this also from 11:59 p.m. From October 27th. So if we just go into what some of these in fact mean. So important to tonight's discussion is from outdoor junior contact sport and non-contact sport for adults is now permitted. So we can finally get many of those sports in our community back on the field, and particularly junior sport, which I know many of those kids are desperate to play, and we want to be able to see those teams back and playing again. We also have changes to libraries, community venues, entertainment venues, which are now open, and also outdoor events opening as well. So that's a change for up to 50 there, and then on November the 8th, that goes up to 70 people. If we move on to the next change, we've got cafes, restaurants and pubs can reopen with density levels of up to 50 outdoors and 20 indoors, and that doubles from November the 8th to, well, it goes from 70 to 40 with density limits as well. So we'll be able to go down to our local cafe and have a meal inside with our friends. And I'm sure people are already out booking and getting themselves a table at their favourite local eatery, cafe and restaurant, and of course our pubs. Retail changes, which means a lot of our great retail stores can now open. Beauty and personal care services can also reopen. So I know many retailers have been doing it really tough out there, and it's great to hear that many of those retailers are now able to open, and they will obviously have their COVID plans in place. And finally, we're seeing changes to weddings, which are now permitted for 10 people and 20 people for funerals, and they go up to 20 and 50 on November the 8th, 20 for weddings and up to 50 for funerals in November the 8th. And religious gatherings can also 10 people and 20 people outdoors. They take place from here on in from October 27th as well. So some really important changes and great to hear that. And I know many people are really, really happy about all of that. So first, I'll just bring our speakers online and just say hi. Nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. How are we all?
Brilliant. Marnie, hi. And Jeremy, how are you going?
Very well, look,
tonight's discussion is going to be great because we've got some real champions of the sporting industry. Marnie, very excited after coming from a Vixens win.
Very excited. I'm glad you got that scarf on, David.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And of course, Earl, very excited in terms of we've got cricket literally around the corner. We're going to talk about things like the Boxing Day Test and India coming to Australia, which I know a lot of people are very excited to hear about. So thank you, Earl. Great to see you.
Pleasure.
And Jeremy, you'll bring it all together because our discussion tonight is also, it's tourism in the broader sense. We need to get people on a plane into Melbourne to be able to take part of what is the sporting capital of Australia, Melbourne, Victoria. And of course, not only that, but we have so many people come here from a broader tourism perspective. You ran Sovereign Hill. I know you'd be still itching to be able to get the doors of Sovereign Hill open. Have you got any insight there for us? Do we know when Sovereign Hill's opening?
They'll be open this long weekend for regional Victorians. Yeah, great. That's a great thing. Iconic tourism, whether it's events or experiences, is what drives Victoria's reputation as one of the world's best venues. So, yeah, very much looking forward to those major things starting to come back onto our spheres of availability.
Brilliant, fantastic. And of course, with the Tourism Taskforce that I'm going to ask you shortly about, your role is a national role. And I know that a lot of your stuff is about, how we get Australia being able to work in things like bringing those aviation back, bringing people in, and obviously getting tourism restarted again. So that will be really, really interesting. I know we've got a number of participants also on this chat with us tonight. If you've got any questions, as always, put them in the chat and we'll get to you after I have my initial discussion with our panelists. And this is an interactive discussion. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what you've got to say. Just finally, before we get into my questions with Earl, Marnie and Jeremy, as I've said, these conversations that we're having in the alternative roadmap is all about putting Victoria first and Victorians first. That's my plan. That's my focus. We want real examples, real ideas that we can contribute that are going to make a difference to jobs, to the economy, to tourism, to the events, to the hospitality industry, and ultimately to all of our lives. We want hope. I've been talking about hope all the way along. We don't want negativity. We've had so much of that in our lives. We want hope and we want a path forward. And that's what this is all about. Could I now go to our first lot of questions? And that's going to be to Earl. And I wanted to just give an introduction to Earl, who's the current chairman of Cricket Australia, managing director of the Riscombe Group. And Earl was the North Melbourne Cricket Club president from 2001 till November 2008. He was the director of Cricket Victoria from 2006 to 2015 and held the position of deputy chairman from 2008 to 2015. And he's also a non-executive director of Empower and past managing director of the ASX listed Greencap Limited. Welcome again, Earl. And if I could ask the first question to you. We're now beginning the cricket season with obviously Boxing Day, the Big Bash, and even later the T20 Cricket World Cup coming up. Will we be seeing the same level of numbers going to these events? And we've seen obviously 30,000 people at a footy game in Queensland. How will we be able to do this kind of thing safely here in Victoria?
Firstly, thank you, Dave, for having me on tonight. I think it's a good day for Victorians. I think we're all got a bit of a pep in our step after the weekend. Firstly, for cricket's already started. We had the women's T20 internationals and ODIs against New Zealand up in Queensland, which I think was a great way to start the season. The women's Big Bash started today up in New South Wales, albeit with a wet start and some of the games washed out. So our season's already underway, and we're really passionate and making sure the women's game got underway, because that was, to me, building on the success of the Women's World Cup. Seems like ages ago, doesn't it? Back in March 8th, we had nearly 90,000 people watching at the MCG. The women's cricket is our biggest thing, both in the community sense, but also strategically. So to be able to support that through COVID times is really important for us. India coming. I've been on the phone actually before this call with Surav Ganguly from India, my counterpart, as the chair of the VCCI. They're keen. We're just locking down now the final instruments around medical, around biosecurity hubs. But they're very excited to come over here. We'll have them soon. We have a fantastic series against India and the men's big bash. So we've got a lot to look forward to. Lots got to happen. Obviously, with biosecurity, we've seen that around the AFL and NRL. How they've got one competition. We've got 7 or 8 competitions. They've got women and men's international, big bash. We've got domestic cricket, Sheffield Shield, women's NCL, etc. So we've got a big season ahead of us, and a lot's got to go right. But I'm just really keen to get cricket back in the community, and
fantastic.
All systems go.
So I mean, we're used to obviously the big Boxing Day crowds of say 100,000 plus or thereabouts at the MCG. We're obviously not going to have that this year. What are you planning for? What type of crowds do you think we can have at the MCG?
Yeah, so we're sort of working with the state government at the moment, and at the moment, today, it's about 25,000 people a day, if all things stay the same. If we get back to what I call COVID normal, and that may increase to 50,000 a day. So, well, that's small by Melbourne numbers. You look anywhere else in the world, they'd die for those numbers. So we're pretty confident, given we've got the world's best stadium, the MCG, that we can get people in and out safely to watch an iconic event such as the Boxing Day test. So if we keep going the way we are, I'm confident we'll be between that 25 to 50,000 people a day.
And how has the whole COVID situation affected the game, if you like, and just particularly, obviously, we've suffered a bit in Victoria. How has that affected us?
Well, if I'm looking at our costs about providing a biosecurity hub for all the various competitions, it's probably going to cost us between $25 to $30 million just for that security, and that's not gold plating, and that's just basics to get our games away. If you look at the experience from the England tour this year, and they did it really well, they provided probably the benchmark. It cost them nearly £100 million to make sure everyone's safe. That's the players, the supporting staff, coaches, etc. So it's a massive undertaking, but so important to make sure we get sport back on. To do that in the world we're living in now, that's a top investment. So cricket, we can just get there, but I hate to feel for other sports who are trying to do the same thing. It's a massive cost. So the quicker we can find and that's going to be like that till we find a vaccine, really, if I'm being honest. So we're all going to live in this, what I call the new world or new norm, until we get a vaccine that allows everyone to come in and out safely.
So I was going to say that. So you think that in terms of what we're dealing with now, that we're likely to see similar types of practices, things that you will need to do in terms of the biosecurity that you've suggested, and also even how it affects crowds and the public coming in and out of venues, cleaning of venues, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, very much so. I think if you look at the MCG, it's a great example. It's a great stadium. So you can have 50,000 people spread out. It's more the access and egress. How do you get them in and out safely when they're congregating on the concourses and public transport to get there? They're the bigger challenges, not so much whether they're in situ. It's about getting in and out. That's I think challenges of all states and organisations, that how we do that safely and for all concerned.
So look, I've got to ask you while I've got you, because a big fan of obviously the cricket and where it's come, and obviously we did suffer from an Australia's perspective some of the issues a few years back with the ball tampering stuff. Obviously the game, and you've done an amazing job, and the board's done an amazing job in being able to reposition Australian cricket the way that it has. My family watched the test only a few weeks ago, and I just thought that was a brilliant program to be able to show how the Australian cricket team got its way back. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about the insight about all of that? You and I were discussing that before about, the public relations exercise with those kinds of things.
Yeah, and thanks, David. I think once again, we did want it to be a public relations exercise. I think once you start doing that, and the Australian public are really attuned to what's authentic and what's not authentic. So we look at the people we put in, Justin Langer and Tim Payne, and our women's team. You wouldn't want for better ambassadors for our sport. So we didn't have to do much in terms of being the real people. We're just allowing them the freedom to express themselves, and it was a big risk to put the cameras in for 18 months behind the scenes. I really pay tribute to Tim Payne and Aaron Finch and Justin Langer to allow that to happen, because that's a pretty ballsy thing to do. And they did it, and I think it showed up that the true people, that they are wonderful people. They're human like all of us, they're vulnerable like all of us, and but this had this immense drive to succeed. I think we saw the value of that when how they played more important than what they won. I think that's restored a lot of respect and trust back in our national team. And the women have always been magnificent. They're great role models. So I think we're very lucky. We've got some fantastic role models there who are, I think, restoring pride now in the Australian cricket.
So obviously, just finally, there's been a fair bit of competition with the other states in terms of nibbing at our heels in Victoria. We saw that with, I'll talk to Marne about the netball and the Australian rules footy and the NRL, which has been sitting for a while anyway. But how do you think Victoria will go in terms of just ensuring that we continue to hold that sporting capital reputation, if you like?
Well, the only ones talking about us not being the sporting capital are the ones who aren't in our capital. The Vixens won, Tigers won, Geelong played against them, and the Storm won. So why are we talking about we're not still the sporting capital? Yeah. I'm lucky enough. I go around the world and look at all the best sporting events and venues, and we're so far ahead of anything else apart from maybe the Perth Stadium, which is a magnificent venue. New South Wales and Queensland, they want to talk about being the best in the world. They're not. They're second rate. I don't mean that nastily. I'm a very passionate Victorian. But, I looked at the numbers last night. So just purely from media, NRL, I think the grand final had 2.7 million viewers. The AFL had 3.9 million. If I looked at women's Big Bash game during the summer, they had more viewers per game on free-to-air women's sport than nearly every the NRL. So it just shows that we're very lucky in Victoria, despite the challenges we're having. When we come out of this, I think we'll just reinforce that how good a sport is in Victoria. Spring Carnival's another great example. We have, it's probably one of the fourth biggest employers in the state. We have people come from all around the world. So we're very lucky in Victoria to have the infrastructure, the culture to support it, and also the world-class athletes that live in Victoria and Melbourne.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Earl. We'll come back to you shortly with some general questions. I wanted to cross over now to Marne. So Marne Fechner was appointed Chief Executive of Netball Australia in April 2017 and brings more than 20 years of experience in sports administration leadership. She's been involved in community and high-performance netball for more than 30 years. In 2015, as Chief Executive of the Netball World Cup, Marne delivered the most commercially successful World Cup ever and has more than doubled Australia's revenue since 2007. Marne was awarded the Sports Executive of the Year in 2016 CEO Magazine Awards. Welcome again, Marne, and so good to have you here.
David, I feel really old after that induction.
You aren't, so don't worry. So I just wanted to kick it off. Obviously, it's been tough. Great to see, obviously, again, a big plug for the Vixens, but been tough. We saw the Vixens play in Brisbane in that final. So how many did we have in that final? Where was the stadium in Brisbane?
So we had at the home of Netball Queensland, which was Nissan Arena, which is a 5,000 seat stadium. So probably not the biggest stadium that we would normally play at if we were playing a grand final in Queensland. But Netball Queensland had been phenomenal in terms of delivering a whole number of matches for us across the season. So we had around 2,500, and that's because we had to work within our COVID safe protocols and our requirements. And it's always challenging in an indoor venue because we don't have that open air opportunity, but nonetheless, in terms of capacity, we're at capacity, which is what you want for a grand final.
Yeah. And obviously that's an interesting number because in Queensland, there are 2,500 indoors now. And we're at 50 outdoors, so we've got a fair way to go. 20 indoors at the moment, so we've got a fair way to go to get to those numbers. But obviously, that's very, very important for the game here in Victoria. What's the plans like? What's the discussion like in terms of around netball, in getting the sport back into Victoria, into stadiums?
Yeah, look, it's been really interesting, David, and netball is it has such a rich heritage in Victoria. It has a massive footprint in Victoria, metro or regional. And interestingly, the game's really evolved first in Victoria in terms of its indoor-outdoor playing community. So we have a number of communities that do play in indoor venues, which present some challenges. And I think we'd love, we've got a fabulous group of venues in Melbourne Park that we can utilise for netball, from Margaret Court to Melbourne Arena to Rod Laver if we wanted to, in terms of going up in numbers. So we'd love to be back playing there as soon as we can. I know that the Vixens were extraordinary, as were the Magpies, in picking up sticks and heading wherever they needed to go to make sure that this year's season was delivered. And there's something in me, probably as a proud Victorian, that's just beautiful about the fact that the Victorian, the Melbourne Vixens, who have been close over the last couple of years, managed to have the most challenged season that we've ever delivered in the competition, and to come out on top is extraordinary for them and a testament to the way they play the game.
Yeah, and it was a close game too. Only, 3 points?
2
points.
Yeah. It was really close. So, and look, and that's the thing. You want a great close grand final, and we delivered that. And it was great for the girls.
So, I just want to get back in terms of the COVID situation and the impact that's had on the sport so far, and also in terms of the growth as well. We heard Earl talk about kind of the initial investment that was needed, or that is needed, just to put a game on of cricket. So tell us, how has it affected, how's COVID affected netball, and what's needed in terms of investment going forward?
Look, I think that from a Victorian perspective, for all community sport, it's been really challenged. We haven't seen netball much this year, and that's been a challenge for us. We had a whole group of athletes that were on our pathway that didn't get an opportunity to play in national championships or in our Australian Netball League. And thankfully, we had the Vixens and Magpies that we could watch on our screens. So you had that connection with the elite game. So I think really the key priority for us is getting community netball back. We know that we can deliver, and we've delivered elite netball under a compromised position. But for us, it's about celebrating the game in communities, and that's where we're all rich, right? We know in pretty much every community, regional or regional or metro, we've got cricket, we've got netball, we've got footy, we've got so much participation in sport. And I think for all sports administrators that are working really hard to make sure that our sports survive, it's about making sure that we have this balance right between supporting community to get back and ensuring our elite are visible.
So I wanted to kind of finish my last question with you around that. So all of our sport thankfully start in the community and start locally and start at very, very junior level. So obviously a lot of kids have been impacted by not being able to play sport, not being able to get out and about. So today's announcement is really important to get junior sport up and running. But I know we had a discussion around the volunteers and community sport. How important is that? And do you think that that's a bit of a concern going forward to try and ensure that we get those volunteers back into community sport?
Look, we all know, David, that we wouldn't run community sport without our volunteers. I don't think any sport would survive within community. So it is really critical. We know that there's been a decline in volunteerism for all sport across the last decade. And it's something we've really focused on, making sure that we feel connected with our volunteer workforce. And we've got really nothing that we can look back to and say, what happened in netball when a pandemic came and made, basically made netball redundant in 2020. So we don't really have that opportunity to look back and say, what would we do? So it is really critical. We need to embrace and celebrate and make sure that it's as easy as possible for our community to get back to sport. We know they love it. That's why they've been doing it for decades on end. And it's not just netball, but I'm sure cricket's the same, Earl, in terms of you have these amazing people within communities that just make sport happen. So I think that the runway back to community sport, it needs to be as easy as possible. And I know that the sports will do everything that they can to support that. And I know in our case, Netball Victoria has been phenomenal in making sure that we stay connected to people and make sure that they know how important they are to the game.
Terrific. All right, we'll be back with you shortly with some more questions. I wanted to bring in Dr. Jeremy Johnson. Dr. Jeremy Johnson is the chair of the ACCI Tourism Restart Taskforce, a national body in looking at how we get tourism back and restarted. In a long and distinguished career, Dr. Johnson also recently served as the immediate past president of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the past president of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And Dr. Johnson also recently retired as the CEO of Sovereign Hill. Welcome again, Jeremy.
Thanks, David. Good evening to Marne and to Earl.
And look, I mean, you've got a really important role. Obviously, you've had some great experience. We spoke briefly about Sovereign Hill and regional Victoria, regional tourism, and how we kind of restart all of that. Tell me, what has the Restart Task Force been focused on? Well,
we've had, by definition, had to take a national and an international perspective into the impact of COVID on the visitor economy. And that's been very enjoyable in the sense of being able to see and contrast just how different states and territories have reacted and had opportunities, as we saw with sport, for example. Some were more readily able to accept the hub concept and deliver the games and the events that we love. But look, the task force role, we had to say, well, look, there is a health issue and that has to be front and centre. If you go back to March when this happened, we'd just come out of the bushfires in southeastern Australia and over in the west. And so there were some issues related to the visitor economy that were being dealt with in a big way, and they got quickly submerged. But from the task force perspective, we've had to focus around assuming or trying to assume that there was a health response that was successful, and then saying, well, what have you got to do on an international stage, a national stage, and a domestic stage to get back to where we were, particularly with in a state like Victoria, if I can be parochial, with being the events capital, the world's most livable city, and all of the things, the natural advantages that we have here with the great cultural tourism and so on that we're famous for. So we had to focus around getting a timetable out. We got one out that was very ambitious, but it put the challenge out to governments at federal and state level and local level for that matter, of saying, look, you've really got to focus around how do we come out of this quickly and what are the things we've got to make sure we focus on. So we tried to articulate that in a one-page document. That's been changed again, updated because of the second stage in Victoria sort of postponing what we thought might happen or hope might happen. We've focused around supporting the advocacy for financial help to the sectors, so JobKeeper and JobSeeker in particular, and it was good to see the federal government able to respond in that space, because particularly, you know, associations and I know institutions like Sovereign Hill were very dependent on that to get them through thus far, and we'll be looking, no doubt, as a visitor economy sector to that going through to March next year.
So, Jeremy, the impact obviously of COVID on some of the industry. I know we were talking before about the aviation industry and inward bound and outward bound, you know, trade missions and all that kind of thing. How can you monetarily surmise that?
Well, just the domestic aviation, for example, that's 91% down, our internal flights. So getting around Australia by air, that's around about $250 million a day is being lost in that business, that sector, and about $60 or so million a day is being lost in the international sector. So I'll give you another indication, just in the domestic economy, if we travel domestically and we go on a trip around Victoria or somewhere, we'll probably, on average, we'd spend $700 a person. Internationally, an international visitor would spend $5,200 a trip. So, you know, there's about a seven-fold difference so you'd need 7 times the amount of domestic tourism to make up for what we're losing coming in from international. So you can see the scale of things. It's a massive, massive challenge.
And I know that you're involved, obviously, in this Restart Task Force about the New Zealand bubble. How important was that in terms of, I suppose, testing something, getting something going, so we can ultimately get other tourists from international destinations back into Australia and back into Victoria?
Well, it was particularly significant because you know, you think of how busy an airport is. It's got taxis, it's got coaches, it's got public transport, it's got people driving there, car parks, it's got bookings, it's got, you know, baggage, it's got passengers, it's got catering, flights, planes, maintenance. All those systems have to be working, and they've got to be, if they've been out of action, they just can't crank up overnight. So the idea, particularly for international travel, was if there is a vaccine, and we all hope that might be sooner rather than later, well, things might open up very quickly, and we want Australia to be in the best possible position to take advantage of that. So, and if that doesn't happen, there will be safe hubs like New Zealand or South Korea's one, Taiwan's another one, and Vietnam, for example, have done particularly well with their COVID suppression regimes. They might open up sooner, and we want our systems to be capable of handling that.
So one last question to you, and I know there'll be lots of people listening to this conversation right now, and I'm sorry to have to get you to crystal ball, but if somebody wants to book their flights to get out of, say, Victoria into another state, you know, maybe, you know, go up to Queensland or something, or even come inward bound to, say, Victoria, how likely is that going to happen, say, Christmas? And what would you think the earliest time would be where we can start to see these flights resume?
Well, if we divide it up into domestic and international, I think, you know, the clear indication from the federal government is it's, you know, the middle of next year, sometime before we can honestly expect more freedom in travelling internationally. And we may not want to travel internationally given the sort of things that are happening in other countries at the moment with their COVID numbers. So that may be restricted by definition anyway. Domestically, you really want, the language we are using is by December. We want to see the state borders and territory borders open up by early December, which means, you know, 1 December, not 24 December. And I would be hopeful that we will see movement. It's another 6 weeks away till that time. And you'd really hope that, you know, encouraging news out of Victoria and where we are, the other states and territories have been advanced on us. Those states are opening up. Probably Western Australia has taken a decision already not to, but for the other states and territories, I would be very encouraged that we'll see open borders sooner rather than later.
Brilliant. I'm going to bring all of our guests back, and we'll go to our first question from Darren Walker. Darren. Here he goes. Yep.
There we go. There's a bit of a process to starting videos and
here we go. Welcome, Darren. Go
Thanks,
for it.
My first question was to Earl, because my concern is obviously that the MCG provides the finances for a lot of the stuff that has pretty much funded Cricket Australia for a number of years. So with a half full MCG, obviously that's going to impact finances, and clearly there's more expenses going in at the moment. How long is that sustainable for?
Well, Darren, been a while since I've seen you, an ex-colleague of mine.
There you go, mate. It is indeed. Yes.
It's good.
When are you coming down to play golf with me, mate?
The way I play golf, mate, you wouldn't want me. Firstly, luckily, we're fortunate enough. Most of our revenue is derived by media. You may have seen some of our challenges with Channel 7 at the moment going around that, but we're very confident that we'll put on a full season of cricket. So while the crowds are really, really important, it's more about fan engagement. So making sure we can get as many Victorians in to watch live sport is our paramount at the moment. We're in a reasonably good financial position. Like anything, COVID has had a big impact on us, but we're confident that with crowds, remember we've got an Ashes next year. India coming this year, our big, what I call Christmas sales series, where it sort of funds it for the next 4 or 5 years. So India turns up, we get reasonable crowds, which I think we will. Then we'll be in a good spot to keep reinvesting back into community sport, which is what our main strategic purpose is.
Excellent. Thank you, Darren. And how's Cranbourne going? All right? You'd be happy that you'll be able to get back on the golf course?
Oh, I'm happy because I live within 5 kilometres or 10 kilometres of the course. But I think you're going to get a contact from Earl Kaplan later today with a petition for Parliament about the 25k zone, mate.
Yeah, no, we do need to get that 25-kilometre zone removed. I believe November the 8th is the date when it's meant to be removed, but it couldn't come sooner. Thanks very much. Over to Solomon Green. Sol, good to see you as a regular viewer.
Thank you, David. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Marne, you did tweak my sort of thing there. As part of the roadmap back, given Melbourne Park has 3 facilities with retractable roofs, being Rod Laver Arena, Margaret Court Arena and Hisense, or whatever it's called now, should we be looking towards the state government to make such venues available at greatly subsidised rates so that stadium sport can return in a reasonable timetable with appropriate social distancing as an outdoor event for elite competitions? And I'm thinking netball, I'm thinking basketball, I'm thinking run up to the Australian Open and the stands they'll build for the outer courts and other types of opportunities that Melbourne Park offer.
Thanks for your question, Solomon. I think it's a really good one, and how blessed are we in Victoria to actually have facilities where we can open roofs, and you know that's pretty extraordinary. And we were talking about this before, and how we factor that into the major event planning in terms of what we've got moving forward, and how could we turn what has traditionally been in netball circles, maybe not for tennis, but for netball, has traditionally been closed roofs venues into open facilities. And I think it's really important for us. We need to ensure that, one, we can optimise the opportunity for our fans to get to the game, and that we can showcase our game in a way that actually resonates. And how great was it? And I know we were watching games that were brought to us by Queensland and New South Wales and the last weekend, but how great was it to have that environment where we could see fans enjoying the game. So I think it is important. I think we've got flexibility, and we can definitely, in terms of, I think we've learnt a lot in the last 6 to 9 months in terms of how we can actually deliver COVID safe plans. And at the end of the day, what we're talking about is keeping our community safe. You know, we want people to enjoy our games, but we also want to make sure that we've got safe communities and healthy communities.
Do you think, just on that, and thanks, Sol, do you think there'll be any resistance of getting fans that have probably got used to watching a lot more things on a screen to get them back into in an audience, in a crowd?
Oh, look, it's a really good question, David. And I can remember being at a conference once and we were talking about fan engagement and what it means to be in the venue at that moment. And Earl, I was at that game in March, which was probably our last big major event before we went into COVID lockdown. And I think there is something to say about actually being in that venue, celebrating a moment in time with people that you don't know, but you can turn to and say, oh my God, we won that event, and or celebrate for our club, for our country, and to reach out and be, there's something to be said about doing that with other humans. And we know that about teams. We know that about team sports, which, Earl and cricket and netball are one of those examples. Part of the essence of what we do is being involved in a team and being involved with something bigger than ourselves. And so my view is that you will never replace being one of those 100,000 at the MCG or one of those 10,000 at Melbourne Arena at a time where something extraordinary happens in sport. And that's the magic.
Yeah, so Marne, I totally agree with that. You think about that night, and I'll never forget that night. You think about, people talk about when they saw Kathy Freeman win the 400 metres. They don't talk about what couch they were sitting on when they watched it. They talk about being at the event.
The feeling.
They talk about when, so-and-so kicked a goal in the grand final, etc. And even after watching the Storm last night, you can say, well, I can go watch it live rather than listen to Phil Gould commentate. So all those great things you've got about live sport and being part of it, and something that the visceral effect of watching live sport, I think, we'll never lose.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks very much. Thanks, Sol. Will Ballew. G'day, Will. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, David. I just had quite a widespread question that I've been quite curious about. And so what's been the challenge in the Australian sport industry, despite the financial hardship caused through the exponential restrictions on social distancing nationally and significantly in Victoria?
So just sorry, you cut out a little bit. So could you give that one again for us?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Thank you. It's quite a widespread question. So what's been the hardest internal challenge in the Australian sport industry, despite the financial hardship caused through the exponential restrictions on social distancing nationally and significantly in Victoria?
Okay, good. So who'd like to have a crack at that one?
I'll dive in.
Yep.
Because, Will, it's been about our people and the impact on our people, whether that be employees, whether that be volunteers, whether that be participants. This has been extraordinarily challenging and no roadmap. So, we were creating as we went. And I think for the majority of sports, we were doing that with as much care and passion that the sport deserves. And I think that that's going to be, at the end of the day, part of what sport does for communities, part of what elite sport does for Australians is that we create an environment where we escape from the normal. We be someone else, and that's been really challenged. And I think for all of us who, you work in sport because you love it. There's a lot of passion, there's a lot of heart, as well as running businesses, and I think that that's what separates sport in communities. Earl, I'm not sure if you want to add to this, but it's been about making sure that our people have a place, and we haven't necessarily always been able to do that.
Yeah, really, really good points, Marty. So I come from two ends of the same spectrum. So if you look at the community stuff, how do you keep community sport going in times of uncertainty where communities are shut down? We've seen the impacts of that around our kids and families around engaging the local community. How do you keep that going? And the other extreme from what I call the commercial edge of sport, how do you make sure you got money coming in and protecting your revenue streams? Because if you don't do that, you can't do the other thing. So a lot of our stuff's been really around protecting our revenue with India coming in, fighting with our broadcast rights, and every sport at the moment is facing that cliff of the broadcast fees. You know, we know there's a cliff coming at free-to-air TV can't afford sport, but they need it. So I think COVID's brought that forward. So sports who haven't been able to navigate through that, I think you're going to find it really challenging. Remember, we're living in, look at Melbourne, the probably most congested professional sporting market in the world. We've got something like 20 different elite, what I call professional sporting teams. No other city in the world has that. So having the people are going to lose. So the media rights and sponsors can't afford to support all those sports. So how do you make sure that how do you distribute that pie? And selfishly looking for cricket, how do we protect cricket's interests? There's going to be a lot of other sports that are going to suffer through that. So I look at how do we protect our community, most importantly, but also how do you protect the business of sport to ensure you can keep reinvesting back into the community.
Terrific, thanks. Did you want to add anything, Jeremy? You mentioned earlier when we had the discussion, particularly around community sport and everything, and the fact that after 6 weeks, people kind of move on a bit in terms of where they're at. I think that was a really good point.
Well, it's a truism that if you do something for 6 weeks, it becomes a habit, and if you don't do something equally, you lose that habit. So particularly with participating in sport, and it's a good point you make, Will, about you know, over time, the restrictions and limitations. One of the things I think is critical for getting back to, you know, a new normal, it will be not complicating the return to junior sport and to community sport. I think that's a critical challenge that's going to face all of the sports and all of the government agencies and authorities, to make sure you make it simple for the kids to get back into it, that they turn up on Saturday morning and the game's there, whether it's netball or cricket or tennis or whatever, and that in particular, the volunteers and the parents and grandparents, in my case, can turn up and be engaged and involved. So that's going to be the critical element, I think, in sustaining and supporting community wellness and a return to very active participation levels.
B, question for you. Thanks, Will. Welcome, B.
Thank you. I've just got a question for everyone, particularly with what we've all gone through here in Melbourne. What do you think the risk appetite is going to be for attendees going to mass gatherings, sporting events and the like? I reckon there's going to be some that are just wanting to party straight away as of tomorrow night at midnight. And there's going to be others that are very, very reluctant to embrace that with everything that we've gone through. So I'd love to hear what other people's opinions are on this.
That's a great question, B. And I know when I'm out and about, you have this very, very divided community. You've got some that have not left their home and that are getting food delivered to their homes. They've kind of been living in this fear, and others have just wanted to get out and about and get on with their lives. So how is that going to play out in these big venues? Maybe let's start with Jeremy. You know, we've got the Australian Open and other big events coming in as well. How's that going to play out?
Well, for a start, I think that's a great question, B. And human nature's a funny thing. People can live with different tolerances of risk. We all know that. We don't want to be careless. That's the first preeminent thing we've got to keep in mind. The big venues, I think racing and you know, Grand Prix and wherever there's a large venue, a large open air venue, Sovereign Hill Museum, for example, you know, the crowds can be catered for quite safely within the safety limits of 1.5 metres social distancing. And by the way, if you multiply 1.5 by 1.5, you get 2.25 square metres, and that's around about the rulings that we need to keep in mind. And if you put that into context, you heard Earl talking about the MCG at Boxing Day, or racing, Grand Prix, football events and so on. I think we can safely accommodate a lot of, and look at concert halls, 2,000 seat venues and so on. If you've only got a quarter of those filled, you can safely cope with crowds of reasonable numbers.
Earl, do we need to do more to actually reassure people from a confidence perspective that these places are safe?
Yeah, I think B asked a really good question. I think you'll have initial upsurge of, oh my God, we're out, let's go out and do whatever we like. But I think your biggest thing is access and egress and transport to and from. It's fine saying you can be safe with side the MCG or Flemington or wherever it might be, but getting to and from on public transport, one of the great things about Melbourne as a city, with great access to our big sporting events and venues via public transport. So to me, the test will be, will people want to travel on public transport to get to and from? And if that's not the case, I think we've got a problem. So I think how people feel comfortable from their risk appetite perspective about going to and from the venues and getting in and out. Once they're in, I think they'll be okay. And I'm very confident our venue management are really good at that. I think it also transposes itself into getting back to work. You know, are people going to travel on trains every morning going into the city to work again? And that's a bigger question for a society around how now, what are the outcomes of COVID and how do we change our lifestyles? And sports is going to be part of that. You know, it's such a big part of our lifestyle and the way we live in Melbourne. How will that change? How will that be impacted? So like I think there'll be there'll be a lot of parties. You know, I'll be probably the first one out there tomorrow night at midnight. But then what happens COVID normal? What will we tolerate from a personal and community perspective at getting to and from venues?
Yeah, thank you. And just a little bit of a segue there, if I could, that Earl's just mentioned. We are having a session coming up in a few weeks' time about future of transport, and we're going to be addressing public transport. We've got somebody from Uber on there as well. So we'll be looking at all of these kinds of things to ensure that we have a safe pathway back to getting our city moving again. Thank you, B. Great question. Our next question is from Ruth. Nice to see you again, Ruth.
Nice to see you too. My question's for Jeremy. Given the other states are likely to want Victoria to have 28 days of no community transmission before dropping their borders to us, is that going to be too late? It'll be practically the end of November for planning for Christmas holidays, December target that you want. And what's your feeling, or what's everybody's feeling about, will there be a reluctance of Australians in other states wanting to come to Victoria because of our disastrous second wave? You know, we've basically become the pariah of the nation.
Yes, Ruth, that's a good point you make. Look, I think we've got to learn from history here. History tells us, if you go back, and I've travelled through these cycles, not as vicious as this one, but history tells us that there's always a quick rebound. And after the Asian meltdown in '98, September 11 Ansett going over in 2001, I think we had bird flu, swine flu, equine flu. We then had the GFC. And very quickly, it was the domestic markets that sprang back. And travelling interstate, I mean, you know, Victorians traditionally go north to Queensland in winter. And we've been pining for that market to open. Your comment about the 28 days, look, I think the National Cabinet is running a very good agenda based on as much data and fact as they can muster. And we've seen how the data in Victoria over the last few weeks has changed dramatically. That's been the same in other states and territories. Tasmania's opened up very much. Northern Territory, South Australia, Queensland. I think you'll find that there'll be in my judgment, there'll be a more open opportunity for that. Judgments like 28 days community transmission free. There'll be a little more tolerance come into that as the stricter controls and testing and tracing and managing outbreaks, as we've said, will become the norm. As long as that's done properly, we'll find, I think, that there'll be enough time. If things are open by early December, people will still be able to plan and travel.
Can I just follow that on to you, Earl? What does that mean also, particularly if we've got the Indian cricket team coming over? Obviously, we have big tourism numbers come from India to watch the cricket, let's say. Will that be enough time for them to plan for the games that we've got planned?
Yeah, interesting. We don't get many overseas travels from India for the Indian Test series.
Right.
We get a lot from the local diaspora coming to the games.
Yeah.
We don't actually get much inbound traffic from India
Okay.
for Test series. Do for the World Cups.
Yeah, right.
Where if I look at next year, we've got the Ashes. We get far more inbound traffic from the UK. So we don't expect big numbers from India for this Test series. So that's a blessing in disguise. But what we do want to see is borders open so people can feel free to travel. And it's more, I think, it's more about the psychological aspect of it too. It's safe to travel around Australia. And that's a big impact on people's morale. But also people who do want to come to Australia feel free they can travel around without having having to quarantine, etc.
Yep. And just Marnie, for you in terms of the World Cup for netball, how's that affected with all of this?
Well, look, thankfully we had our World Cup last year in Liverpool, so we're once every 4 years. So we're, look, we're hopeful and working. I think we've got Com Games first, which are back in the UK, and then our next World Cup is in South Africa. Okay. So we've thankfully got a four-year window in terms of between events. So who knows? And that's, I suppose that's the uncertainty, David, in terms of, I think Earl said before around a vaccine, and Jeremy, we talked about that as being something that we were hoping for. And so it does create some uncertainty in the system, and even, I think even the little impacts around international sport, around rankings and qualifying games and all those things we've taken for granted, we just can't anymore. So that flexible approach is important.
I suppose you would have never thought that you'd get a season away back in March.
Oh, never. Like, I mean, the whole process of, I can remember going into meetings that went for a couple of hours, and by the end of that meeting, the information we had at the start was irrelevant. And that's how quickly things were moving. And what we learnt really quickly in terms of just the flexibility is that the system, which is big and cumbersome, just needed to understand the information that we had at hand, understand the decision that we needed to make, and lean into the fact that we either wanted to have a season happen, a Suncorp Super Netball 2020, or not. And 8 weeks out from the start of the season, no one would ever have, and I've seen Nadine on the call tonight, the Zoom tonight, we would never have considered hub delivery model, never, 8 weeks before. And so that's how quickly, things change in sport.
Yep. Thank you. Our last question we've got is from Nadine Cohen. Hi, Nadine. Thanks, Ruth, for your question. Nadine.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody, for tonight. Found it very valuable. One of the questions I've got, and we've seen it play out recently with the Indian cricket team potentially going into Queensland to quarantine and train and get ready, and then that didn't come off and move to Sydney. One of the big things is athletes returning overseas after the seasons and then needing to come back into the country. I'm keen to know from Jeremy's perspective, and this is an apolitical question, how long do we think that the 14 days of mandatory hotel or other quarantine is going to continue, and also the caps on international travel into the country, particularly for those people who may be looking to return back to Australia who aren't Australian citizens?
Yeah, that's how long's a bit of string. And that's part of the reason why the Tourism Restart Taskforce got into the idea of opening up a bubble with New Zealand and safe travel, so that those sort of questions and the systems that are needed to be associated with all of that activity can be tested and fine-tuned and the risks managed. New Zealanders can come here without quarantining. That would be great. I'm sure there's a lot of South Pacific islands, and that will happen with agricultural workers coming in. They'll be able to come without quarantining. And I would certainly hope, as I mentioned before, there's countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and so on, where they have very good COVID management records. And if you can open up those bubbles and things aren't going wrong, nothing succeeds like success. If the systems are working and if there's not the inherent problems that we had to start with, well, the opportunities to open a little bit more broadly will come. The worry is, of course, what's happening, or the outbreaks in Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere. They're very hard to manage. So you understand why the governments, both federal and state, are reluctant to put a timetable on international travel. I think they'll still work strongly with the bubble concept, though.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that, Nadine. We're going to, time has flown so fast, I can't believe it how quickly we've gone. We're going to now move to a final thought from our panellists. And I wanted to ask you this. We in our Restart Victoria, or putting Victorians first, I wanted you to imagine for a minute that you were the Premier of this state, and that you needed a slogan that was going to be used to sell Victoria to the rest of the world. In a sentence or so, what would that slogan be that you could go out there and say, Victoria, we're open for business, here we go. So who'd like to kick off with the first one? Who'd like to go first?
Ask the marketers first. No, mine would be welcome back. Victoria, welcome back.
Oh, good on you, Jeremy. Nice and simple. Victoria, welcome back. Earl?
Well, I'm always amazed by the resilience of Victorians, and I think we've got a lot to look forward to. So I'll be saying is bring it on. We are the best state in the world. So make sure I'm probably being a bit more bombastic about it, but I'm a little bit sick of being kicked by other parts of Australia by being Victorian, and quite frankly, I've had enough. So we don't need anyone else. We can do it by ourselves, and we've got a great place to live. Now, how do you get that to a 3-word slogan? I'll probably go with Jeremy.
Good, excellent. Marnie?
I reckon, Jeremy, you've stolen the show tonight in terms of closing, but I'm going to say play because we love to.
Right. That is fantastic. Well, look, I just wanted to thank you all, Earl, Marnie and Jeremy, for a really, really interesting conversation piece. We've learned a lot tonight. We've learned just how important our sport and our tourism is to this great state, and how we need to get people back to sport as soon as possible, and get back to the regions, get back enjoying what makes our state such a wonderful place to be part of. And can I say that it's very, very important. We've been talking a lot at sport at the elite level, but we've also been referencing a lot about community sport and how we need to get people back in, whether it's being volunteering back in the community and helping our kids and our clubs and people playing sport again, and also obviously being able to provide those opportunities for everybody back locally into doing this. And finally, can I say one of the most important things that I think many people would agree with, and I've heard this a lot, that being able to have the sports being played and being able to watch the sport has done a wonderful thing for many people's mental health and wellness. I know that even during the likes of the AFL season, there are a lot of families that said they look forward to each and every week where they had something to actually watch, and particularly their kids to look forward to. So sport plays an absolute huge part in our lives. Tourism, being able to get out and about and enjoy life is also a big part of that going forward. Thank you to all of you. Best of luck in terms of the important roles that you have to play. Thank you to everybody that's been involved in this conversation piece. As always, stay well. Enjoy Victoria coming out of lockdown. It's a great time. It's a time for celebration. It's a time for bringing things back to what was a normal period again, enjoying life, enjoying people around, and enjoying the face-to-face which we have missed. As always, if there's anything my office can do, please reach out. We're only a phone call away. Thanks again to our panellists. Thanks for the riveting conversation. Thank you to all of you out there. Stay well and good night.